So we have just a little bit more to talk about with pulmonary ventilation, and some of that you actually saw in the video. So here we're going to talk about what changes or what factors affect how easy it is to breathe. One is resistance in the airway. So if you have a cold, say, or an allergy, you may have more mucus in those airways. More mucus means that the lumen, the opening of the bronchi and the bronchioles, the other respiratory passageways, becomes smaller. And just like with blood vessels, the smaller the opening, the higher the resistance, which means it takes you more work to get air through those pathways. It could be structural changes. If the elasticity of the lungs becomes less as you grow older, or even you could be very young and start to have a COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. If you, say, work in an area with asbestos, or if you work in construction, or even with textiles, believe it or not, or dyes, you may find that there are fibrotic changes or scar tissue that starts to develop in the lungs, in the lung tissue, as a response to those pathogens. I actually saw one day when I was teaching about the respiratory system, two fairly young looking men working with a jackhammer outside of the window, and neither one had any kind of PPE on. Neither one of them was wearing goggles or a rebreather or even a simple surgical mask, a simple, just keep some of the debris out. So if they kept going on that pathway, they would probably develop early COPDs from increasing airway resistance. As we talked about with surfactant earlier, less surfactant means more surface tension in the alveoli, which means there's much more resistance to opening the alveoli. Lung compliance, and what lung compliance refers to is how well do the lungs perform the job that they are meant to do? How well do they comply with what they are supposed to do? That can change with deformities of the thorax. So if you have someone that's, say, barrel-chested, or they have changes in the structure of the rib, or a depressed thorax. A depressed thorax would obviously mean that thoracic volume has limitations, or increasing thoracic volume has limitations. Ossification of the costal cartilages means that the cartilages, that hyaline cartilage, starts to become hard so that it's less flexible when we breathe in. Paralysis of the intercostal muscles can occur both with age or with trauma, perhaps. So when we talk about pulmonary ventilation, we also talk about measures of how well do we do that? How do we figure out if a body actually is compliant in terms of the respiratory system? So there are volumes and capacities. The capacities are usually mathematical calculations, and the volumes are these individual volumes. Now, these numbers aren't necessarily ones that you need to memorize, but you should know conceptually what these volumes and capacities are and what the relative volumes are. Please make sure that you check with your instructor for sure. Tidal volume is the amount of air that's breathed in or out with normal inspiration and expiration. And that may not be clear in the textbook. It's either for inspiration or expiration, not the sum of both. That number you should know. It's about 500 milliliters, so about the size of a small water bottle. Expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that you can breathe out above and beyond tidal volume, so forcefully expired past tidal volume. Inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that you can inspire or inhale above tidal volume. And see, that is much more than expiratory reserve volume. Residual volume, which is right here, think of residual volume as kind of your emergency backup, just in case you weren't able to inspire or inspire enough. You do have this residual volume that is extra air in the alveoli, air that's not actually exchanged unless you're desperate for it, because you would normally be breathing with tidal volume, IRV, and ERV. Vital capacity is one of the more important of these numbers, and vital capacity is about 4,000 to 5,000 milliliters, about 4 to 5 liters in males or females and males. Males tend to have larger bodies, larger thoraxes, so they have larger vital capacity. And vital capacity is the sum of tidal volume, ERV, and IRV. Vita means life. So vital capacity is all the air that you can forcibly inhale and exhale while you're alive. The difference between that and inspiratory capacity is that inspiratory capacity also involves residual volume. So let's do a brief review of how inspiration is controlled. Primarily, it is the medulla oblongata that influences respiratory rate and volume. The pons also helps to influence those as well, and there are some specific centers within the pons and the medulla that do that. The pons is really about evening out breathing so that it's rhythmic and it isn't disruptive to the other functions that your body does. The intercostal muscles the intercostal nerves innervate the intercostal muscles. The phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. It is the only innervator, the only nerve to the diaphragm. And it comes out in the cervical spine and the cervical plexus, and that particular nerve would be one of the reasons that using a cervical collar or bracing the neck after some kind of blow to the head or the upper body is pretty important, as well as making sure that that airway stays open, that it stays patent as well. So how does the medulla and the pons actually know whether to change breathing rate or change the depth of breathing? There are central chemoreceptors, and peripheral chemoreceptors that are in places that are the same as for the heart. So where the heart knows to change its rate or is signaled to change its rate due to these chemoreceptors and their information, the ones for respiration are in a similar place. The peripheral ones at the aortic arch and at the common carotid artery are there to, with the aortic arch, make sure the blood that's going out to the rest of the body is oxygen rich, and for the common carotids helps to make sure that blood going to the brain is oxygen rich. So specifically, these chemoreceptors for carbon dioxide are especially sensitive, as we'll see later. Where there is more carbon dioxide in the blood, there are more hydrogen ions, which means that blood becomes acidic. The brain in particular is highly sensitive to changes in pH, especially changes that make CSF more acidic. So that is the strongest, most powerful stimulus for the medulla and the pons to change breathing rate. For the heart, the cardiovascular system is more concerned about oxygen content. Now, remember, the two of these systems, cardiovascular and respiratory, really do work hand in hand. So what I've just said is like saying the respiratory system looks at respiratory rate and heart rate from one perspective. The cardiovascular system looks at it from a different perspective. They're both looking at the same thing, but from different sides of the coin. If PO2 declines slightly, then ventilation might also increase, but PO2 has to drop pretty significantly for respiratory rate to change. Heart rate might change very quickly, but respiratory rate may not change as quickly. So we just spent a lot of time talking about pulmonary ventilation, how air gets into and out of the body, the factors that affect how well air gets into and out of the body, and how the brain especially controls, the medulla and the pons control breathing rate and depth. So now we're going to turn to a short discussion of external and internal respiration, because there really are two sides of the same coin again. So external respiration occurs between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillary, and that is by diffusion, which is a passive process. Gases move down their concentration gradients from, if you look at O2, and this should say millimeters of mercury, from where there is more pressure or higher pressure of oxygen to where there is a lower pressure of oxygen, from 100 millimeters of mercury to 40 millimeters of mercury. And the same principle but opposite direction is true for CO2. The pressure of CO2 in the pulmonary artery is about 45 millimeters of mercury. In the alveolus, it's about 40. So, using the diffusion principle, CO2 will move from the pulmonary capillary to the alveolus. Now you'll notice that I'm not comparing PO2 to PCO2. I'm comparing oxygen to oxygen and CO2 to CO2 in terms of pressures. And you'll also notice that the gradient for oxygen from 100 to 40 is much steeper than it is for CO2. CO2 can have a much less steep gradient, meaning a lower differential between these two areas, and CO2 will diffuse very, very easily. Now the same principles hold true about diffusion, meaning that gases are moving from where there's more to where there's less, where the pressure is higher to where it's lower. But for internal respiration, we're looking at the tissues of the body, the cells of the tissues, and the systemic capillaries. So here we're going to see carbon dioxide move from the cells to the systemic capillaries, and then vice versa for oxygen. Oxygen's going to move from the systemic capillary to the tissues. Right? Now you probably already know that from real life. We're just looking at the science behind it. And you will also notice, hopefully, that the partial pressure of oxygen is lower here in the systemic capillaries than it is at the pulmonary capillaries. So if you think about that and look at this bigger schematic, the pulmonary capillaries are here, and let's say we're just dropping off gas over here at the acromial region of the shoulder. The pressure of oxygen is lower because you've already dropped off some oxygen in that space, in that interim between the lungs and the shoulder. In the next video, we'll talk about how that happens, how the transport of gases happens, and how come every tissue, even the very peripheral tissues, still have oxygen to get from hemoglobin.